Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are breaking down a truly bizarre new sight on the battlefield, Russia's so-called Dandelion Tank. And you'll see why. It honestly looks more like a scrap metal sculpture than a modern weapon of war.
This question really gets right to the heart of the whole story. And the answer, as far as we can tell? Well, it looks like a really strange mix of welded rods, old tired armor, and just sheer desperation.
And here it is. This is the contraption in question. And get this, it was officially patented by Russia's Ministry of Defense. What you're looking at is a T-Series tank basically wrapped in this multi-level cage of metal rods and mesh. And it's all designed for just one single purpose, to try and survive on the drone-filled battlefields of Ukraine.
So to really get why this thing even exists, you've got to start with this number, over 4,100. That's the number of visually confirmed Russian tank losses. It's just a staggering figure, and it really sets the stage for this massive crisis in Russian armor. It's forcing them to try, well, stranger and stranger things.
All right, so let's dig into this a little deeper. Because the Dandelion Tank? It didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's actually the latest step in a really weird, you could almost call it an evolutionary line of battlefield improvisations. And each new design is basically a reaction to how badly the last one failed.
So, if you look at this timeline, you can see this progression. It's been fast, but man, has it been flawed. It really started back in 2023 with these so-called turtle tanks, which were literally just crude metal sheds welded right onto the turrets. When those, unsurprisingly, didn't work out, they moved on to hedgehog tanks, covered in spikes. And that brings us to today, and the Dandelion.
Someone described this whole cycle perfectly. They called it less like military innovation and more like a comedy of errors with fatal consequences. And that really hits the nail on the head. Because every time they tried a solution, it just introduced a new set of deadly problems. Things like tons of extra weight, huge blind spots, all of it just turned the tanks into slower, easier targets.
Okay, so now let's actually analyze the Dandelion itself. Russia's Ministry of Defense is so proud of this thing, they actually patented it. But the real question is, how does the theory behind it hold up in the real world?
All right, look, on paper, you can kind of see the logic here. The whole idea is that the cage will detonate an incoming drone's warhead before it can actually hit the tank's main armor. If you're just charging straight across an open field, maybe, just maybe, this buys you a few precious seconds. It could force the enemy to use 2 or 3 drones to get a kill instead of 1. But, and this is a huge but, there is a massive, massive gap between that theory and what actually happens on the battlefield. Yeah, sure, the Dandelion might stop a couple of drones out in a wide open field, but the second that tank rolls into a city or a forest or any kind of complex terrain, all those supposed advantages just disappear. And suddenly, it's not an asset, it's a gigantic liability.
And we're talking about some absolutely crippling flaws here. For starters, all that scaffolding, it snags on everything. Buildings, trees, debris. It makes snurtling, that's the term for those quick, stealthy movements between bits of cover. It makes that pretty much impossible. Then you've got the huge blind spots it creates for the crew, so they can barely see or shoot. And on top of it all, the extra tons of weight are just pushing these old engines way past their breaking point.
So here's the really crucial point. This isn't just about one bad tank design. No, the Dandelion Tank is really a physical symptom of something much, much deeper. A massive industrial and strategic failure that's gripping Russia's entire war effort. And this chart, this chart just lays out the core problem perfectly. Look at this. Russia is managing to produce about 250 new or modernized tanks a year, but they're losing them on the battlefield at more than 3 times that rate. The math just doesn't work. You simply cannot sustain a war effort with numbers like that. And because that rate is so unsustainable, Russia has been forced to just dig deeper and deeper into its old stockpiles. First, they burned through their best active duty tanks. Then, they started pulling the next best stuff out of storage. Now they're at the bottom of the barrel, trying to refurbish completely derelict vehicles, and even, I'm not kidding, pulling World War II-era T-34s out of museums and sending them to the front. For decades, good tank design is always about balancing 3 key things. It's like a triad: firepower, protection, and mobility. You need to be able to hit the enemy. You need to be able to take a hit, and you need to be able to move around the battlefield. A successful tank has a good balance of all 3. But here's the thing about the Dandelion Tank. By bolting on that crazy cage, Russia has completely thrown that balance out the window. It undermines all three principles at the same time. The firepower is worse because of the blind spots. The mobility is shot because of all that extra weight. And you can even argue the protection is worse, because now it's just a bigger, slower, and way more obvious target for literally everything else on the battlefield.
So all of this brings us to a final and I think really critical comparison. And that's the huge difference between how Russia is trying to solve the drone problem and how Western militaries are approaching it.
On one side, you have Russia's approach, which is all about physical, brute force improvisation, right? Just weld more metal onto it. But on the other side, you've got the Western approach, which is focused on high-tech innovation. We're talking electronic warfare to jam the drone signals before they even get close, and active protection systems, or APS, that can actually shoot down incoming threats automatically, all without slowing the tank down.
And it really brings to mind this one quote that just sums it all up perfectly. When you weld metal flowers onto your turret and call it innovation, you've admitted defeat. I mean, that's really it, isn't it? One approach uses smart, integrated technology to solve the problem. The other? Well, the other is basically a public announcement that you're completely out of good ideas.
When you really think about it, the Dandelion Tank is kind of like Russia's entire war machine in miniature. It's the perfect symbol for what happens when your big strategic goals are way, way bigger than your country's industrial power to actually make them happen. It's desperation made out of steel.
And so, that leaves us with one final question to think about. Is this bizarre steel flower a sign of clever, on-the-fly adaptation to a new kind of war? Or is it really the last gasp of a failing war machine? A symbol of a military that's lost its technological edge and is just slowly bleeding out on the battlefield?